Welcome to the NBA Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo at jgilbo11, taking a look at dailyfantasycafe.com. Final NBA pod regular season for me here. For us, Brent was on Wednesday, but we will be doing a NBA playoff breakdown when that comes about, when seeding's finalized. Look for that. Should be pretty soon, 2 weeks or so. The reason that we're tuning out a little bit early, one, is to get a focus in for MLB next week. We'll be doing slate breakdowns for that. Also, some of this stuff can be kind of irrelevant as the day goes on. We're just dealing with so many late scratches and so many misinformation as far as injury reports go and teams tanking. It's not a great time to play NBA DFS, but I realize people still obviously are going to play. But just dealing with some of these teams that are tanking, it's tough to deal with. So we tend to focus more on baseball as things come into this. But today, final regular season pod. We'll still have cheat sheets, still have an article and stuff going up on the site. So none of that is going away, just the podcast. But do appreciate everyone for tuning in this season. Hope you learned a lot. Do appreciate some of the feedback that we've gotten, comments and stuff. And definitely note most of that moving forward. But did have a fun year. Jumping into this slate here, it's a Big Ten game on a Friday. Obviously, we're going to be dealing with, once again, some probably injuries coming out through the day. We'll do my best to stay on top of that through the comment section if there's anything major, something drastic coming on. But otherwise, we're kind of on our own at this point. But diving in Clippers and Indiana here first. 217 over under. Indiana favored by 3.5. Look at the Clippers side here. I definitely don't mind getting some exposure. We look at this Clippers team. I mean, not terribly fun right now as far as the fantasy production goes outside of a few guys, but that's kind of going to be what it is moving forward. I don't have a ton of interest in the backcourt just because Indiana has been such a strong backcourt team of late. I don't have a lot of interest in Austin Rivers. Finding cash games, just because he is playing 35 plus minutes. I didn't like the upside in that Milwaukee matchup. I'll still stand by that. I don't think there's a ton of upside here. I do think he can get you between 25 and 30 fantasy points, and that's kind of about it. I'm looking more at DeAndre Jordan here. I know Indiana's been solid against centers of late, but just another excellent rebounding spot, another spot where he can put up strong numbers and at a price tag that I feel is still reasonable without paying all the way up. So I like Jordan in this spot. I like Tobias Harris as well. Bounce back in a matchup against Milwaukee, put up 36 fantasy points after being kind of under the weather. Look at Indiana. I mean, middle of the road against power forwards of the last 10 games. I think Harris, you can go there. Lou Williams, not really all that intrigued. Still probably a decent cash game guy. I just think the upside's pretty much gone out of him at this price still, just given the fact that the peripheral numbers come and go. He hasn't really put together a complete game where he's racked up the 30 points and 8 assists and maybe notches a steal or two. It just hasn't happened in a while. So Williams could be burned out. He's not shooting the ball particularly well over the last few games. Once again, cash games is fine, but GPPs, you're probably looking a little bit elsewhere. Outside of that, Teodosic, I put up 24 fantasy points. Doesn't have a ton of upside. Probably not a 10-game slate. You're not going to really be looking his way. Montrezl Harrell, don't have a ton of interest. You can still use in GPPs because he's fairly cheap on DraftKings, 5K on FanDuel. Not going to be really looking to go there. Indiana side of things here, been some pretty average fantasy production, but I will say the Clippers defensively have been a team you can target. 27th in defensive efficiency over the last 10 games, relying 114 points per game in that span. I like some of these guys here. I like Victor Oladipo, and I haven't liked him for a while now. But I like some upside in this spot just against a Clippers team that's bottom 5 in defensive efficiency and fantasy points allowed. 2 shooting guards over the last 10 games. I think we can see an upside spot out of Oladipo. The price is coming down a little bit on DraftKings. FanDuel is still 8,900. I still think you can look some other directions. Darren Collison, fine cash, GPP option. He's, back starting over the last 2 games. Definitely don't have an issue with him. Minutes should be fairly safe. I know Corey Joseph will still see some off the bench, but Oladipo and Collison still getting a majority of the run. Guys like Thaddeus Young still fairly solid. I mean, below 6K, you can continue to go that route with these guys. Have some upside in GPPs, but you look at Young. I mean, can get it done steals wise. It's a Clippers team that can turn the ball over. An average rebounding team. So Thaddeus Young should be fine at the price tag. You can look to use him. Miles Turner in GPPs is still a fine option, but there's a lot of centers that I like tonight. And obviously, on the other side, I definitely prefer Jordan much more. Lance Stevenson in GPPs, we saw the floor in the minutes last time out against New Orleans, but obviously the upside against a Lakers or Washington team that is there. He has been much better at home. He's averaging 5 more fantasy points per game at home this season, so he's a viable look. It's a good matchup for him, but like I said, it's just too tough to trust in cash games. You're looking GPPs. Denver, Washington next here. Paul Millsap popped up on the questionable tag here today. I think Millsap obviously would be a strong play if he plays. Illness is a little bit concerning. We've seen that kind of with a couple of guys of late where it took a toll on their fantasy production. If Millsap sits, I think you're obviously going to have some interest, and obviously you're going to probably likely see maybe some Mason Plumlee or Wilson Chandler jump to the starting lineup. I think both are viable. I think Lyles might be kind of the odd man out. As much as I like him here, I think Mason Plumlee is going to be the guy that steps in and picks up still probably about 25 minutes. You might see some little bit of Lyles. I don't think he's going to be really enough to be relevant. I think Plumlee would maybe be a guy to take a shot on in GPPs. Wilson Chandler likely going to be the biggest beneficiary here. He's been a guy who's been very solid on both sides. I like going back to the well here against a Washington team that has struggled against wings for quite some time now. Will Barton continues to be a valid option filling in for Gary Harris. Usage a little bit down when he does start, but still viable. Still, shot really, really well against Chicago, which finally, but obviously it was the blowout. They won by 30 points. That's what we're dealing with this time of the year, especially. I mean, we saw it last night. Memphis gets basically doubled up by Charlotte. This is just what's going on right now. It's not fun to deal with as far as fantasy. That's why we're transitioning into the baseball season. But you can definitely use this game. The Denver should be in a closer game here against Washington. All these guys very viable. Jamal Murray, he's viable in GPPs. I don't love the spot here, but he has shown some upside. I love the matchup for him against Chicago. Even in his poor shooting games, he's racking enough rebounds and assists to kind of give himself a reasonable floor. Borderline cash, but you're still probably looking at GPPs. Jokic continues to be a viable option. Put up 36 fantasy points in 23 minutes. Like I said, that game was a blowout. Kind of expect him to produce here. Did put up over 40 fantasy points in a prior meeting. What kind of killed him over on FanDuel was the turnovers, the 7 turnovers. Hasn't really been an issue of late. So you can definitely an option. Still just a GPP guy for me, though. And obviously, we have seen, him play a little bit better without Millsap. So that kind of would be a little bit of a benefit if he sat, but not too much I'm putting a ton of stock into. Washington side of things here, I like some of these price tags. I think both Bradley Beal and Otto Porter are interesting. Denver's been a team that really hasn't been great defensively of late, and I think you can look at this game as probably one of the more high-scoring ones on the slate that I don't know if a ton of people are going to be looking at just because it is an early slate, and we have, some teams in some really promising spots like Milwaukee against Chicago, like Minnesota against the Knicks. The Phoenix, Cleveland's obviously going to be something a lot of people target, but I think getting exposure to some of these, Bradley Beal and Otto Porter, 2 guys who have been kind of trending downwards, haven't shown a ton of upside of late. I mean, Beal had the great game against Boston in overtime. Porter, outside of that, was fine in that game, bounced back against the Spurs. Both of these guys are interesting cash and GPP options on tonight's slate, both positions that we've seen Denver kind of be average against of late. Markieff Morris is really interesting at his price tag too. Love the upside out of him. Bad matchup against the Spurs. I don't know what happened against Indiana, but outside of that, been very solid. You look at Denver, bottom 5 in defensive efficiency against power forwards the last 10 games. Definitely look to go that way. Satoransky, very interesting here. Didn't have a great game against the Spurs. Didn't score a single point. He was 0-8 from the field. Definitely a bounce back spot here against Denver. Love taking point guards against the Nuggets. Satoransky very much in play. If you need a cheap small forward, you can take a look at Kelly Oubre. Not my favorite option on a 10-game slate, but he is viable. Marcin Gortat, No, I'm not doing it tonight. Sorry. That's kind of about it for this Washington side. Phoenix and Cleveland next here, 229 total. Phoenix is obviously going to be something that we have to keep an eye on. TJ Warren, questionable for tonight's game, probably leaning more on the doubtful side. Devin Booker, questionable as well. Obviously, if one of the two sit, we're going to get Josh Jackson. I still think Josh Jackson's viable, even if those guys play. I still think the minutes are going to be there from off the bench. But obviously, we like him more if one of these guys sit. His price tag is up a little bit. Good spot here against Cleveland. We saw Jackson put up a solid game against Cleveland a few games ago. He's doing a little bit of everything right now, so that's a nice thing given the fact that his shot can be a little bit ugly at times. We have seen that, but he's definitely viable. He's been in some tough matchups of late and still producing, so Jackson continues to be a viable option. If Booker plays, you can play him in GPPs, but I just think he's really banged up right now, and I just think that that arm and elbow issue and everything that he's dealing with is going to be a little bit of a factor. Elfrid Payton minutes are completely gone now. We're dealing with basically a situation where we're seeing Shaq Harrison get some minutes. We're seeing Tyler Ulis get minutes. So I'm not terribly intrigued here. Alex Len came out of nowhere, put up 19 and 12 with 3 blocks in 25 minutes. Tyson Chandler likely done for the rest of the year. Len and Bender would be guys that see a ton of minutes. You can look to use these guys in GPPs. I'm not going that way in cash games on this slate, but it is interesting to note that obviously with Love back, some of these traditional centers will kind of get hurt maybe a little bit, but still viable options. TJ Warren, I don't expect to play. Even if he plays, I'm not terribly interested at his price, just working his way back from an injury. So Sun's definitely something that we need to keep an eye on. Given this is a 7:30 game, we should have that out in time. Phoenix has been pretty good about that this season. Cleveland side of things, LeBron, I won't say that he's too expensive because he continues to defy all odds of late. Obviously put up huge numbers against his Phoenix team, as you expected, has been putting up phenomenal numbers down the stretch here. Even at 13-1 on FanDuel, I think you got to look his way still. LeBron 12-1 on DraftKings. Yeah, these prices are extremely high, but matchup against Phoenix, you expect him to produce. If you don't want LeBron exposure, I think you still can get some exposure through Kevin Love here. 29, 24 minutes. Usage rate right around 29% since being back. Crushed Toronto, crushed Milwaukee in limited minutes. I'm back on the Love train here in this spot against Phoenix. Obviously, a team that allows a ton of rebounding, doesn't play a ton of defense. This bodes well for some Love upside tonight. Usually is a guy I'm not particularly thrilled on just because on FanDuel because he doesn't rack up the stats defensively and it kind of hurts a little bit. But I see a big double-double game out of him, possibly like a 23 and 12 type of game like he had last time against Toronto. So definitely in a good spot. You can take flyers on George Hill in tournaments. That's kind of about where he lies at this point. That's kind of where everyone else lies. We need to keep an eye on like Tristan Thompson and Larry Nance and Rodney Hood. None of these guys I'm terribly interested in, but I'm curious to see how like Larry Nance works back in with Love, but we'll have to see. Jeff Green should still be a viable value option at his price. Obviously put up a big game against Phoenix. A lot of that was kind of defensively driven. Doesn't have a ton of upside still, though. But you can use him in cash games, still getting a decent amount of minutes, especially if guys like Nance and Hood are out. If they are playing, Green doesn't really have a ton of production or upside at that price. Minnesota and New York. Minnesota only favored by 7 here, 226 over under. Obviously, Minnesota, one of my favorite teams to target here tonight, and I don't mind getting exposure really through anyone here. Obviously, this is a New York team that's bottom 10 in defensive efficiency, allowing a ton of rebounds. Definitely viable. He's been tremendous. I mean, six double-doubles over his last 7 games. I don't mind using Towns here. There are still some cheaper centers that are viable, but he is in play. Just at that usage rate, like without Butler and the production that he's had without Butler has been very solid. And that goes the same for Jeff Teague. Teague continues to be a viable option. He scared me a little bit last game, but came on the 4th against the Clippers. The upside's there. He continues to be at a price tag that it's just inviting. It's inviting to play Teague every night right now. So definitely a viable option. Andrew Wiggins, still playable. Like he's a solid cash game guy. It's just a matter of if the peripherals will follow. You rarely see 3 block games out of Wiggins and the steal last time out. You just don't see that type of stuff. You rarely see the 5 assist games that he had against the Spurs. He's viable, but still not my favorite option from this team. I'd rather play Teague or Towns, or we got Belisha here, who's just a solid option. He's just logging a ton of minutes. The Clippers game was a little bit of a downside. Didn't shoot particularly well, didn't play a ton of minutes, but I expect him to bounce back here. Taj Gibson, you can use in cash games. He's still pretty cheap, doesn't have a ton of upside, but in the right matchup, he's playable in cash. Knicks side of things here, don't have a ton of interest. Michael Beasley in GPPs is fine, given that he's still logging some solid minutes. He's obviously drawing the starts here. He's playable. Kyle O'Quinn and his Cantor, it's just tough to predict. We kind of expected Cantor to take a back seat, then he plays 30 minutes against Miami. Kyle O'Quinn was playing really well before that and then took a back seat and played 14 minutes against Miami. I just don't know what to make of this Knicks roster right now and what they're going to be doing. None of the guards interest me on a 10-game slate. Tim Hardaway Jr. seems to be the only viable option. Struggled against Miami, kind of as expected a little bit. I didn't mind him. I didn't think we were going to see such a horrible game out of him. I just didn't think the upside was there. But I will say that there is some upside in this spot against a Minnesota team that has lacked against shooting guards over the last 10 games and really with Butler out all season long. So if you're dying to get some Knicks exposure, like Hardaway is a fine option. Cantor and O'Quinn are just GBP's plays at this point, and probably just more of a DK thing where you can roster a few extra centers. So that's about it. Brooklyn and Toronto. This Brooklyn side, their minutes continue to be pretty lengthy as far as the rotations go. I will say I think Jarrett Allen is interesting as a value option. Just given that his minutes have kind of been right around that 25-minute mark. He has some block shot upside. We've seen Toronto struggle against opposing centers of late, so I don't mind using him as a GPP guy. Outside of that, though, not terribly interested in some of these other guys. Like Rondae Hollis-Jefferson will always be intriguing just because he racks up so many peripheral stats. He's been playing really well, and the price tag dropped down a little bit given the matchup against Toronto. So I think 6,500 6,600 on both sides here is pretty fair. You can definitely look to go that way. Russell had a tremendous game against Toronto last time out. He's a GPP play at best. I'm not willing to go there in cash games. He's playable. DeMarre Carroll continues to be an excellent kind of cash game option, but it is a tough matchup for him. He is a little bit more pricey. So I think if you're sticking with guys here, it's Jarrett Allen for cheap, and it's Rondae Hollis-Jefferson, but none of these Brooklyn guys are terribly excited. D'Angelo Russell as well in GPPs. I think we're more intrigued by the other side of this game. We need to keep an eye on Toronto here. There are definitely rest candidates the rest of the way. We've already seen it with Lowry. DeRozan. Would not be surprised if we saw like a Valanciunas or Ibaka sit out here tonight. So we need to keep an eye on the front court. Jakob Poeltl, Pascal Siakam would also be guys that fill in if Ibaka and Valanciunas sit. So those would become viable options. All these guys are still viable anyway against this Brooklyn team. They struggle against opposing bigs. They just struggle defensively in general. So we're going to be looking at guys like Valanciunas and Ibaka if they play, but definitely like the bench guys of Siakam and Jakob Poeltl for value options. And obviously they would get a big bump if one of those two sat. Same thing kind of goes to the backcourt there with DeRozan and Lowry, guys we need to keep an eye on. Lowry continues to be the guy that I prefer here. I'm not big on DeRozan unless like Lowry sits, but DeMar DeRozan is playable. I think the upside's a little bit capped here in this spot. Kind of just see a modest game out of him. Lowry, I think, has a little bit more upside for the price. That's just torched Brooklyn as expected. He's done that the last few years. He continues to be overlooked this season at an ownership rank. So you can go back to the well on Lowry. If I'm ranking guys here, I'm definitely looking at Lowry. I'm definitely looking at Valanciunas and Ibaka if they play. I'm definitely looking at Lowry. I'm definitely looking at Valanciunas and Ibaka if they play. But you can also get exposure to like the Fred VanVleets and DeLon Wrights. You expect them to see plenty of minutes. Last time these two played, VanVleet put up 20 fantasy points. You expect him to get some solid run off the bench, and if anyone 12 is surprisingly DFS relevant and in a good spot here tonight with a 117 implied total. So definitely want some exposure. They have cheap guys. They have high-end options. So they bring a little bit of everything here. Milwaukee, Chicago, next team that we definitely need to talk about here. We look at Giannis. He is doubtful for tonight's game. And with that being said, we jump into basically Bledsoe, Middleton, and Parker and what they bring to the table. All these guys hover really around a 28% usage rate, all kind of around a 1.10 to 1.15 fantasy points per minute when Bledsoe, Middleton, and Parker are on the court and Giannis is off. All three tremendous options in cash games and GPPs. I am not worried about ownership here, even with them probably being chalky with Giannis out in a matchup against the Bulls. You just have to look their way at their price tags. Tremendous upside in this spot. The matchup is tremendous. Three of my favorite plays here tonight. If I had to rank them, it would probably just be Middleton, Bledsoe, and then Parker, just in terms of an upside standpoint. But maybe I gotta put Parker over Bledsoe. I think Middleton, Parker, Bledsoe is how I would rank them here tonight. But it's hard just because I love all three so much. And Parker on a points per dollar basis should be one of the better plays tonight. I expect Parker to be really chalky. At 5,700 on FanDuel, like he's playable. And then you look at 5,400 on DraftKings, like play 30 minutes. Obviously you kind of expect him to be around that. I don't expect him to really jump into more, given that he's going to see a usage bump against a Chicago team that struggles against power forwards. Sign me up here for some Jabari Parker. These guys are all viable options. Not super thrilled. You might see like maybe some Brandon Jennings slip in there, some Tony Snell slip in there. And you can see Middleton maybe move to the 3. That's probably would be my guess of what happens here tonight. But it's the big 3 there for me. I'm not really looking at any of the value options. And as I said, a matchup against Chicago is where you're going to want to really target. On the Chicago side here, Zach LaVine out, Chris Dunn out, Antonio Blakeney out, Paul Zipser doubtful, Lauri Markkanen questionable. Markkanen will throw a little bit of a loop into things with like Bobby Portis and like Noah Vonleh. If Markkanen sits, we're in the same story as we were before. Vonleh becomes an excellent value option, continues to be a double-double threat on a nightly basis for a cheap price tag. Bobby Portis, safe cash game guy, does have some upside now. If Markkanen plays, a little off of Vonleh just because I don't know what the minutes are going to be like, and the same kind of goes for Portis. Not a 10-game slate. I'm not tremendously thrilled, especially with the Bulls team that's just been playing like crap. Denzel Valentine, still a GPP option. It has a tremendous usage, whether he's starting or off the bench. Has that peripheral upside, just needs to basically find his shot. Hasn't found it in the last 2 games, but he's viable here in the spot against Milwaukee. I don't mind going that route. Everyone else is just not exciting. I mean, Cameron Payne's at a higher price tag. Like, it's not a great spot against Milwaukee. They don't allow a ton of peripheral stats to point guards. Like, he's probably still a safe cash game guy, his price, but just doesn't have a ton of upside. Cristiano Felicio, I don't know what to make him at this point. 3 straight games where he's been over 20 fantasy points. Sure, you can use him. I don't mind targeting centers against Milwaukee, but like I just think on a 10-game slate, like you're still going to probably need a little bit more upside out of your center. So probably not on my radar at most, but I will give him an honorable mention. Miami and OKC here tonight. Game's intriguing, I guess, like from a fantasy standpoint. Miami, I don't love the matchup here against Oklahoma City. I know they've been a little bit, I guess, average defensively of late. We're still dealing with like Dwayne Wade and Hassan Whiteside being doubtful. With that being said, it is a tough matchup in the front court of Oklahoma City for guys like Olnick and Bam Adebayo and James Johnson. I think Johnson's probably the most intriguing here in this spot. I could kind of see Adebayo flopping a little bit, maybe Olnick not showing off quite that upside now for his price. With that being said, he has been fantastic. I think he's viable in GPP still. I'm probably going to be looking elsewhere in cash games. I think Johnson, given the fact that he can do a little bit of everything here and play some positions that OKC doesn't tend to guard particularly too well, he'd be my preferred option, but definitely both are viable. Josh Richardson, still a decent cash game guy, going to play a ton of minutes. OKC's been pretty pedestrian against small forwards of late, so he is viable. Goran Dragic, once again, I'm just not thrilled here. Yeah, usage is there every night for him. He just can't put together complete games. He does not rack up defensive stats at all, which does kind of hurt his upside, but he's 6,500 on FanDuel. It's not a bad play here. Over on DraftKings, like 6,600. Decent cash game guy, but that's about it. The Tyler Johnsons and Justice Winslows of the world, I'm not too intrigued with on this slate at all. OKC, you can definitely look at Westbrook. I don't hate him here tonight. I think LeBron is still maybe a little bit of a pay up option I kind of like using more. Steven Adams is actually my favorite play from this OKC side. We look at Miami, bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed over the last 5 games, bottom 10 over the last 10 games. They're dropping in defensive efficiency with Whiteside out. They allow a ton of rebounds with him out of the paint, giving some monster games to opposing centers of late. Adams is in line for a nice double-double here. Can he get those defensive stats to really, really break through that ceiling? Definitely can. So I will say he does have some GPP upside. I do like him in cash quite a bit. He's my favorite here. I'm not big on Melo, but you can still play him at his price tag because he is cheap. Paul George is an interesting option here tonight, but just really hasn't had the upside that we're looking for. But at his price tags, like he's a fine cash game option. He's 8,100 over on FanDuel. He's below 8K on DraftKings, so definitely viable. Corey Brewer at a new price tag. He's 5K on FanDuel. He becomes fadeable, but you can continue to look to use him. He's still 4,600 on DraftKings. You can go back to the well there. Don't have an issue. As usual, it's basically the 4 guys for OKC, and that's about it. Utah Spurs, by far the worst fantasy game on the slate. 193 total, 2 teams that just play at a snail's pace, play solid defense. On a 10-game slate, I'm not taking the easy way out here. I just don't feel like you need to really target this game. You can look at Donovan Mitchell in cash games just because that price tag has dropped for playing the Spurs. He is viable. You can look at Ricky Rubio in GPPs. I will give you that. He does have the upside. We've seen it in this spot before. I mean, he put up a monster game against the Spurs last time out. Has seen a decent usage of minutes. Price tag will be pretty fair given the matchup. No one will be going there in GPP, so you will have an ownership angle. So I think Rubio's an excellent tournament option, and Mitchell's fine in cash games. That's about it here. Everyone else is a little bit too expensive. I could see Gobert continuing to have a solid game. I just don't think the upside's really there for that price tag. And guys like Joe Ingles, Jake Crowder, not terribly excited. You can look at Crowder still just because he is cheap, like 20, 25 fantasy points in the spot is not going to kill you at that price, but that's about it. Spurs side of things here, it's been the LaMarcus Aldridge show. You can go back there, but on a 10-game slate with guys in better spots as far as pay-up options go, it's not my favorite. Wouldn't be surprised to put a 50 burger, but I don't know how much it's going to really help you in terms of this slate. Like there's some better, cheaper power forward options with upside, so might be a little bit off. Guys like DeJounte Murray had a decent stretch here of late. Not terribly intrigued with like the Danny Greens and Kyle Andersons in this matchup. Spurs have just played some kind of horrid basketball at times this year, and I could see this one kind of being another one. So not particularly thrilled. Boston and Portland, though, this is an interesting game here. I think from a fantasy standpoint, it might not be as attractive as what people think. These are 2 top 10 defensive teams still, even with the injuries. I will say on the Boston side, it would get maybe a little bit easier if Nurkic sat. I do have some interest in like a Greg Monroe who's still viable off the bench. That's kind of about it. Jason Tatum still seeing a decent usage in production. Those are kind of the 2 guys I have the most interest in. Al Horford's just been completely off of late, not shooting well, and that's kind of killed him. So lovely. I have landscaping right outside my window, so you'll have to deal with this for the last 2 games. I apologize. Jason Tatum still a viable option here. Marcus Morris continues to be leaned on offensively. All these guys are cash game GPP viable, but they're just secondary options on this slate. Don't have a ton of interest in Horford here. He is cheap. I just want to see something really out of him before I get excited. With Lillard improving defensively, Rozier's a fine cash game option, but GPPs, I just don't think there's really a ton of upside here with this team outside of maybe Tatum and Morris for their price tags. On the Portland side, we're going to continue with the same stuff here. Though it's an option in GPPs, it gets to be fine where you can use him. Um, Cash games, he's a little bit too expensive for me. CJ McCollum, not really on tonight's slates. Yusuf Nurkic, he is questionable. He has been excellent. If he plays, excellent GPP option because he is still cheap. But if he sits, I think Zach Collins is a guy that we can take a look at for basically bare min across the industry. We've seen him slip in even with Nurkic playing at times, and we've seen some decent games out of him. Can be a little bit foul prone. That is a concern, but Boston's been bottom 10 in defensive efficiency against centers the last 10 games. So I think obviously him and Davis would be attractive GPP options if Nurkic sat. Alfred Camino has been fantastic. You can continue to look at him. The price tag really isn't going to scare me off. Not a spot that I'm really afraid of with this Boston front court. So Portland, not that intriguing of a team. Boston, not that intriguing of a team tonight, both defensively. There is a reason why it is one of the lower totals. These are two kind of grinded out teams that, yes, they look attractive for fantasy, but they really haven't been this year. So Atlanta Golden State, last game of the night here. This game's interesting just from a fantasy standpoint because we have so many guys on the injured list and so many guys that we need to kind of keep an eye on still. Atlanta, John Collins questionable, DeAndre Bembry doubtful, Delaney, Jalen Morris out, Dennis Schroeder probable, but he's been a guy that they've kind of been up and down with. He did rest last night, so I hope he plays. Schroeder, viable GPP option. Obviously, we saw upside against Utah. We saw upside against this Golden State team last time out. So definitely very playable. He is, if you're kind of high on some of these Golden State guys, like you can look at Schroeder as options. If Collins sits, I think Dwayne Dedmon continues to be an interesting double-double option. He'd be viable. Mike Muscala, like he's playable in as a cheap option in cash games. Doesn't have a ton of upside, but should play around 20, 25 minutes and be around kind of a fantasy point per minute player. But I think Schroeder and Prince are kind of your guys that you're looking to get exposure to. Prince is a viable option. He's shown off a ton of upside. Against a team that's kind of lacking a lot of defensive presence now with Green and Durant out. A little bit easier of a spot. I will not be diving into the Isaiah Taylors. I don't care about what Taylor did last night. I'm not thrilled. If you want to go there in GPPs, be my guest. I just don't love a lot of these guys that are basically playing 20 to 25 minutes, cutting into each other's workload. Atlanta's rolling a really deep, guard. It's just, with Schroeder back, it's just going to kind of drop everything down a little bit. You should see Schroeder and Prince eat up plenty of minutes here. And that's kind of about it from this Atlanta side. Golden State, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, Draymond Green all out tonight. Steph Curry due back. Right now, it doesn't say that he's going to be on a minutes limit. I kind of don't care what his minutes limit is. He put up 40 fantasy points in 23 minutes against the Hawks last time out. With Durant, Green, and Thompson off, he has an insane usage. And it is a small sample size because obviously you don't tend to see Curry on the court alone with those guys. But massive fantasy points per minute, massive usage rate. You got to look at Curry here tonight against this Atlanta team that's bottom 10 defensive efficiency against point guards. Curry will definitely be a guy that I'm looking at as a top 3 player to roster with everyone out here as long as the minutes are going to be fine. I'll scale back exposure if there is some sort of minutes limit. But I think Omri Caspi is also a guy that we need to definitely watch and keep an eye on. If he's back and back without a limit, I love him tonight as a value option. If he sits, you're going to continue to see Andre Iguodala. You're going to continue to see Nick Young. I don't like paying $5K for Nick Young. He is playing a ton of minutes, put up 20 fantasy points in 22 minutes against his Hawks team. He would be viable. Kevin Looney's viable here as a cheap option just with all those guys out. But like I said, if Caspi comes back, the interest really just kind of lies with me with Curry and Caspi. If Caspi sits, you can still look at guys like Iggy and Looney and Nick Young and, of course, Curry. So definitely viable. It will be interesting to see what happens to Quinn Cook. I still think he gets some run. I still think he's a viable option here. Could see Curry play off the ball a little bit more, so that could be something. But Quinn Cook has definitely earned some time. I wouldn't expect him to just disappear even with Curry back. So still definitely playable. That's it for me. I know these solo pods are a little bit rough. Forgive me for my landscaping outside as well. If you are tuning into MLB, we will have our slate breakdown coming up soon within the next few days. We will have that NBA playoff preview pod, but regular season, we're done. Everything will still be up on the site. So good luck the rest of the way with NBA. If you're sticking with us for MLB, we'll see you soon.